I'll introduce myself because I have a slide on that later, but my name is Rich Taylor. I'm the VP of Marketing. Mainly just kicking this off for Ezra and Kelly, who are the real experts in this. I guess my expertise comes from, I've worked, starting at my first job in software, I worked remote. So I worked in a small satellite office of a company called MySQL, and we worked out and there was about 10 of us. Most people worked from everywhere else. I got kicked out of the office because we grew too big and they didn't want to expand the office. So I started working from home 2 years into my career, which was really odd, and most people did. So that was kind of a unique experience early in my career. And I've worked for companies that work remote off and on my entire career. And so slides should be coming up. All right, so today we're talking about tips for maintaining and improving your QMS while working remote. And my assumption is most of us are working remote now, and in this pandemic, and I kind of wanted to start with a very simple, just brief explanation of what, let me see if I can move this forward. Oh, there we go, of what Qualio is. So Qualio is a QMS software for the entire life sciences ecosystem. So we have customers that are, in all aspects of life sciences, mainly medical device, pharma, biotech, and then a lot of suppliers as well. We want our three main pillars for our product are make it easy to use, scales with you as you grow, and we're trusted globally. We want to be trusted wherever you're at, that it'll work and be there. No one wants to go through an audit that that doesn't work, and we want to make sure that everything's there for you. Because of our customers, we've got some nice awards. So that's all we'll talk about our product on this, but we just want to know who we were. And I want to share just a couple tips before we kick it over to Ezra and Kelly on working remotely. Now, I think we should definitely start by saying most of us are not working remotely. Qualio is a fully remote company. We all work from home or a small office space we rent nearby our homes. But right now we're all working from home during a global pandemic. So Kelly and I have talked about this a lot, but we are both have kids at home now in school at home. That's definitely unique. I think the main tip for me is try to find a home office or somewhere you can work. I work out of my bedroom. You might see the bedpost behind. So sometimes kicking my wife out at 7:30 in the morning for a call or earlier is sometimes inconvenient, but this is the space where I work. The kids know it. We have a little trailer out back that sometimes I even get kicked out into when my wife, she's a therapist and she has calls in here, so I get kicked out to the trailer, and it works good. But to the next point is, if you having internet connection inconsistency, try hooking up directly to a modem or router. You can buy long wires or cables on the internet. That's just something that some of us have found. And then I think the last little tip just to start is take breaks. Try to separate being at home and being at work. And that can be a tough thing, but I think, this is an interesting situation. Kids, people are all feeling it. We have different spouses that maybe weren't at home or we've never done this before. So those are just simple tips from many of us, especially Qualio, as we're a fully remote company, trying to say we've felt this, but our lives have changed too, even though we've been doing this for a while. All right, we'll kick to the next slide here. And just introduce Kelly and Ezra. So Kelly brings 20 plus years of QA and RA experience, many of those working on distributed remote teams. And I think that's just a really unique thing. I've worked with Kelly now for a few months and she's great. Really appreciate all she's done. Ezra is a quality consultant. He's been working with Qualio on many different projects. So it's been great getting to know him too. He's a mechanical engineer by trade or by training with QA and RA director experience in medical device industry. So he helps us out with a lot of that on the medical device side and everywhere. So really appreciate him joining. So these are your presenters, and we'll just kick it right over to him with the next slide.
Awesome. Thanks, Rich. So hi everyone. It's nice to virtually meet you guys, and we really do appreciate you taking some time out of your day to spend some time with us, talking about some of the things about remote work and managing a quality system from that perspective. Just in talking to some of our customers as well as other colleagues in the field, it seems that the impacts of this whole global pandemic have varied pretty widely from some organizations just being completely shut down at the moment to other organizations where they're actually busier than normal because they're spinning up ways to help fight the pandemic, and that organizations that are bringing in test kits that weren't previously approved in the US. I'm aware of other organizations who have pivoted to, their whole manufacturing operation is now focused on trying to make hand sanitizer or other PPE type products. So yeah, it's an interesting time to be in quality. The regulatory landscape is certainly a moving target at the moment as well, so that's another challenge to be managed. But we wanted to spend a little bit of time today just sort of talking about ways to continue to operate your quality system per the regs in a way that's compliant. We don't necessarily have the luxury of just setting everything down and walking away for the next month or 2 months or however long we're all in shelter in place orders. So some of the things to look at from a quality system perspective is really what's critical internally, and how your operations have been affected, looking at the ripple effect of those things. If you're a small startup and you're managing all of your product processes through a contract manufacturer, obviously, there's a lot more communication that needs to be happening. We're personally experiencing that in some cases that communication is actually very interrupted because the CMO has pivoted. They're making hand sanitizer, so they don't really care about developing our product right this moment because they're all focused on hand sanitizer. And so, asking ourselves what processes are still operating, what are broken, and then applying some risk management, some organized thinking about what are the impacts of that process, and then what are you doing to mitigate that. If you're a quality unit supporting an actual like you have manufacturing in-house, what processes are still running, what is broken. Some manufacturers, of course, in our efforts to enforce social distancing, for example, that might have an impact on your manufacturing floor and people being in there at the same time, and how close the operations were. All that stuff are things to consider. And so, as you're going through those processes and looking at resourcing and allocating those resources, obviously the production group, the operations type groups are managing those decisions. And as a quality unit, your job is to support those decisions. So, if processes and operations are having to change, from a quality system perspective, how does that impact training, for example? Are we having to throw together new procedures, get everybody trained quickly, or, as people get sick and can't come into work, and operations is having to move resources around to keep manufacturing operations running, are there new training needs that need to happen? And in that, in all of that vein, are you, as the quality unit, are you still working on site? Are you working remotely? Or some hybrid thereof? And just making sure that as these things happen and you react to these things, that you're capturing all of that from a document perspective, because in the end, when this is over and we're all getting back to normal in our new normal, whatever that looks like, if we didn't document it, it didn't happen, right? That's our favorite saying from an FDA perspective. So just making sure that you're capturing all of these changes, and if you need to set up a new risk management, template form, for example, and say, okay, well, here's the change that happened. Obviously, your change control process comes into play, but how you justify or document the risk assessments and things behind some of that might change, might need, some more rationales and that sort of thing. So that's kind of some of the internal parts. And then we talked a little bit about external, but Ezra, do you want to spend
Sure.
a minute here talking about the external stuff?
Absolutely. And like Kelly said, you're going to have these internal changes and they could impact your external changes and vice versa. So if you're a virtual manufacturer, you're obviously going to be impacted by your supply chain. And obviously if you're, doing your full operations in-house, you're going to have supplier impacts as well. So, you need to ask yourself what part of the supply chain is disrupted, what's the impact there. Are you going to have available parts as you predicted, parts and components that were on schedule before? What's that look like now? Obviously, it's likely going to lean towards delays in that area. So how can you balance that and manage that? How does that impact your internal scheduling and how you keep your day-to-day operations running? For a lot of folks, it's going to look like, operations are going to slow down. So do you shift some of those folks towards your quality efforts or have things sped up if you're working on COVID-related products? And do you have some of your quality team helping over in operations or helping your suppliers meet their demands? So there's a lot of scattering around, and like Kelly said, you really want to make sure you're documenting all these adjustments and making sure if you're remote, you have the ability to do so. Also related is, travel restrictions. So if you have, with this going on for the better part of 2 months now, you might have run into needing to audit a supplier. How are you able to do that? Do you need to visit your contract manufacturer to check on their operations, how they're getting by with developing product? So, you may be fully adjusted to working remotely and all the logistics that come with that, but you can only be as prepared as your supplier in some of these situations. So really coordinating with them if they're able to, getting audit related activities set up, Zoom meetings, whatever, outlet you use. Can you take virtual tours of the facility? Do you need to look at the manufacturing process over video? How are you preparing for these things? So there's a lot to think about in terms of external preparations as well. And also, and I'm sure a lot of you thought of this as well, is what's the response from the regulatory bodies? Are we still on audit schedule? Should we expect an audit? And that's going to differ depending on, are you manufacturing product already? If so, what's that mean? If you're in development, you may have submitted 510Ks, or you're waiting for response from FDA or any regulatory body on any questions you have or submissions. Are we expecting 45 to 90 days on something, on a response? If you're not working on COVID products, you may have an extended, a delay on response to that. So these are all things you'll want to consider is, where am I at in the priority chain with COVID going on? And what should I expect from the regulatory bodies in terms of attention towards my operations? It's likely you're not going to be audited right now, although, we're kind of in the same space as a lot of you where we're not sure. This is really unprecedented right now. So it's really really important to consider these things in terms of how you prioritize your day-to-day operations right now.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Kelly and Ezra. I think these are great overall questions to ask. One question that came up is, have you two seen audits continue either as a supplier or with customers we're working with currently, just in your purview?
Yeah, good question, Rich. We've not seen any regulatory activity, or not much, from an audit perspective within the customer base and some of the ones that we're working with. We have seen, supplier relationship type audits continue. So customers are getting creative in managing things, from a remote perspective, whether it's scheduling through Zoom meetings, organizations who previously maybe have not made documents available electronically, in that sort of setting, right? You can only review our procedures if you're on site. We're seeing a little bit of that change, and I think, that it sort of is a nice segue into our next slide, where we kind of talk about paper versus software. So I don't know, from a demographic perspective, those of you on the call, if you're working in paper-based systems versus working in an electronic system, but that if you're in paper at this point, this is a great opportunity to start capturing your rationale for moving off of paper. Paper systems do make remote work obviously very difficult, and I've seen scenarios where, people are looking at sort of this emergency implementation of DocuSign or some of that kind of activity, but it's making a paper system better isn't, I don't think, necessarily the most efficient way to go about it. And again, we're biased here. We're an electronic QMS tool, but coming from industry, using electronic QMS tools certainly does make that easier from that perspective. And I'm currently in the process of hosting a couple of customer audits of our system, and it has been, electronic availability of documentation does facilitate that, as well as, as Ezra talked about, maybe can you, if we can do virtual tours of facilities. We have a customer we're working with who's trying to stand up a new manufacturing process right now, and we can't go do the initial, supplier qualification audit on site, because even if we were allowed to travel, to another state, the site has restrictions on who's allowed to be in the facility right now. So it's definitely a challenge. So yeah, touching on paper a little bit, if you're working remotely right now and you are in an organization with a paper QMS, do you have access to your records right now? Are they allowing you in the facility for some amount of time? Or are you having to get creative about how some of those things are managed? Again, keeping the whole mantra of, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. Keep documenting, just keep documenting everything you can. Try to organize things so that you can get into the system later. If, some facilities, at least, in my past lives, different facilities have had restrictions on allowing documentation to leave the plant. So, that could definitely be a huge challenge. But really, again, keeping back to what is still running in your organization, and then looking at what's critical, and really putting your focus on that. I'd be keeping a running list of changes I wanted to make when we were all back to normal, to try to help with from an efficiency standpoint. In assessing what's critical, assess what has timelines. MDR reporting regulations have not been suspended if you have product in the field right now, and you have, you may not be getting the information in a timely manner, given how the communications are going these days. But if you become aware of a device issue, for example, you're still required to report that and meet the deadline of the 15 or 30-day reporting, depending on what's going on there. Development deadlines being another place where, depending on where you are in your submission process, if you had certain responses due to the agency within certain timeframes. You're going to want to make sure you keep a close eye on those, and communicate if you can with your reviewers. I've heard some mixed reviews on responsiveness from the agency on the business as usual things. I'm hearing in some circles that they're getting immediate responses and everything's fine, and I'm hearing other circles where they're saying, look, it's been crickets, we've submitted these questions, we knew we had a deadline coming up, we've gotten no feedback from the agency on it. So again, depending on where you are in your cycle, but for your responsibilities around that, you're going to want to make sure that you're documenting, you're capturing what's happening, your documented attempts to contact, all of those things, make sure that stuff is captured. If you work in a paper system, then that could be a challenge. From an EQMS perspective on these kinds of things, again, what processes are functioning or not functioning? Do people have the right level of access as resources are redeployed to support different bits of the organization? Again, training is a consideration, and then, do people have the right access? If you've got a backup person to somebody who's out sick, who's now the acting supervisor, does that change their permissions in your system? All those kinds of things, need to be looked at from that perspective, documented, captured in those documents, and that way, you can capture your rationales and justifications for things that maybe aren't happening on the timelines that are required. One of the possible solutions, that Ezra and I've both used successfully in these, not obviously in this particular setting, but as big outside forces happen to an organization, and you have things like CAPAs that are open and are due next week, I would look to your quality system to help justify and manage the fact that your timelines are slipping. I think in the big picture, when this is all over, the regulators are going to understand, that these things were out of our control, but they're still going to expect that you have continued to use your quality system to manage them appropriately. So, I've been in situations where, a small organization lost their funding for a while, and so we had to write a CAPA about our CAPA system to say that, all of these activities are halted until funding is resumed. And so basically we were using our quality system to capture the rationale and the justification for the fact that the design control project wasn't moving. So there's no way for us to meet, a CAPA verification of effectiveness deadline when the organization as a whole is not moving forward. And so just because the funding was interrupted, it doesn't mean that the quality system, got to pass either, right? So we continued to just sort of capture those events, write that blanket CAPA that said everything's on hold. At the point that everything comes off hold, we will then reassess our timelines. We'll write extensions to the CAPAs where appropriate. But you're using your CAPA system even in the face of crazy outside forces happening to continue to keep things in a state of control. Ezra, do you have any thoughts on that to add?
Yeah, just to kind of build on what Kelly's saying here is, if you're in a bind with what to do during this time with, important decisions within your company on reporting or whatever it might be, you may not find the answers from the regulatory bodies, and they may not actually have the answers depending on what the question is. So your best possible solution is to really use the kind of the tenets and the logic that's intended within, quality management to sort of craft your way through it by documenting everything and, assessing risk at every step of the way. So, prioritize what delays you have based on what this means for your end user. If you're juggling between a CAPA on issues within your organization on training versus some ongoing issues with parts and components that have moderate risk, put those two side by side. What's this mean time-wise? What's this mean in how are we going to, how much time to get this fixed through our supply chain, and what's the ultimate risk to the end user? So just kind of use the general tenets you see in a normal world regarding risk and what it means for your operations, and try to apply those to a really strange time we're in. So
It's great.
All right.
Oh, next slide.
Yep.
Cool.
Next slide. Communications. So again, working remote. We can't just walk down the hall and pop into somebody's cube, ask some questions about things, kind of keep those things off the record, and then go back to our official system of record, if you will, and document, those conversations. So some other, things about managing your QMS, right? Communication is really, really critical on lots of levels, but obviously in this situation, it takes on a whole new level of criticality. So one of the things that's really, really, really important, and this is true whether you're in the office or working remotely, please ensure all official communications related to quality issues are captured and channeled to the appropriate storage locations. The last thing you want to have is lots of, let's say your operations are still running, you've got a problem on the floor, the initial communication could be, hey, there's this problem on the floor, emails happening, and then pretty soon it spins into everybody on the email thread, speculating about what might be happening on the floor. You need to shut that stuff down quickly. Anything that you communicate or put into writing is discoverable, and so in the horrible event of, an example, right? I used to manage a complaint group for a medical device organization, and periodically, customers, like, lawsuits would occur, right, over product issues or perceived product issues, and everything in our complaint files is discoverable. And so, having to sit through depositions and be asked, are there any other communications related to this issue? No, there's not. They're all in our complaint system. You need to be able to sit there and say that with all confidence, that there isn't some email thread somewhere that might come up later where there was speculation about problems that were happening. So ideally, your personnel are trained in your CAPA process, your nonconformance process, your complaint process. The people who need to be involved continue to be involved even though you're working remotely. It's probably worth a conversation, and it could be an email, to say, if there's any of these issues, please pick up the phone, have a conversation, follow up that conversation with the email iteration of what you just discussed, if it is something that needs to be part of those official records. But the alternative is, of course, to have people putting the conversations into those records directly. Assuming you have, a robust electronic quality system, that's very possible. People can continue to work on these things no matter where they're located. Yeah, formal communications policy around quality issues is, again, it tends to kind of go unsaid when we're all working together in a manufacturing facility, for example. Now that we're working remote, this is a very important consideration. If you're not sure, or if you see one of these email threads starting to spin out of control, pick up the phone. That's, wait, stop, full stop, let's get on the phone. Let's talk about the issues. It's not to say that those speculations, the troubleshooting, all of that shouldn't occur. It should, absolutely. And everybody has their perspective on the issues as they happen, and that's important to capture. But it's very important to capture those appropriately, so that you don't expose any inappropriate risk to your organization.
Yeah, and I'll just add to, finding what works for you is going to be different based on your organization. So if you're making this switch right now, or if you've already made it, you may find yourself using Skype and Teams and Slack and all these different applications, thinking, the more digitally plugged in I am, the better we are, and the more efficient we are. And you'll find pretty quickly, if you're not organized in the digital realm, you're going to miss just as much stuff. Whether it's, catching a week later, oh, marketing sent this advertisement out and QAR, I didn't even see it. Well, how did that happen? It may have been sales and marketing may have blasted it on every channel and said, hey, take a look at this. But if the way you're, receiving those communications and the groups set up aren't well organized, or if there's, if you got 100 groups set up, yeah, that's a lot of groups and that's great, but you start getting in the weeds pretty quickly and it becomes less focused. So just keep an eye on that. If you're remote, more isn't better. Just, try to focus on what's efficient, what are the right channels for each process. And there's a lot of growing pains involved. I've never run into a perfect system yet for that. So it's always a learning process.
Definitely. All right. Audits. We touched on this a little bit earlier, and again, kind of a reiteration, right? Our normal business as usual, for your on-site audits, we all kind of have processes set up for this. Some are more formal than others, depending on the how your organization is run. But obviously, on-site is kind of out the door right now, right? So on one hand, it's nice, there's some logistical things that we don't have to worry about, right? Like helping, the customer that's coming in find a hotel nearby or any of those kinds of things. But again, the documentation piece, which is, outside of the facility tour, what they're coming to look at, right? What we're experiencing in this realm is definitely a little more upfront scope asks, scope specificity, for example. So it's kind of that normal audit process to request a copy of their quality manual and their procedures list, and then you kind of read and look through and start directing the things you're in the flow, the things you're wanting to look at. And we're finding that we're having, to provide more of that information up front so that the auditee can prepare and figure out how they're going to make those records available to us to review. If they have any QMS, it could be possible to provide remote access to a system. If they don't have that possibility, then it's a whole new challenge. Some of those guys, whether they're having to have somebody go in and scan things or, put things up in a shared drive location, and then obviously all the security and things that go around that, so there's definitely some interesting changes to this process. Ezra, did you have any other thoughts here?
Yeah. And you might just, this is going to be another area where you might have to get creative and really rely on your communication with your supplier or whoever, whatever the auditing situation is to work something out. If you're scheduled to audit a supplier right now, but you've had operations shut down the last 2 or 3 months, you really want to take that into consideration. Do I even need to audit at this time? Or, as long as you have the proper justification for what's going on, there's a whole lot to consider at this time, if it's really needed. So take all those things into account. If you can work out with a supplier, like we mentioned earlier, if you can take a virtual tour, if you can get pictures of the process and attach that to an audit report with all the pertinent information and what you would normally, report on, it's really a time to get use some creativity, as long as you're capturing things with risk and having these records documented in mind.
All right, next slide.
Yes. So there are situations certainly where one might argue that QA is least affected in terms of being forced to be remote, right? In many organizations, you might have some of your quality folks that are very embedded in your manufacturing teams. They're highly affected, and then you have a whole lot of your quality organization that's sort of the behind the scenes, just sort of supporting from that documentation perspective and keeping things going. So again, outside of the scenario where you have a paper system in place and your files are all stored in the office, you can if you're not running your manufacturing and trying to keep that up and running, what kinds of things can you look at? This is a good opportunity to really assess the complexity of your quality system. Change control, looking at descriptions and references. Does your change control require 9 people to sign off every time? Is that really necessary? And it's sometimes it takes some of these sort of emergency use situations to really look at the system as a whole. How big and structured has it gotten, and is that really necessary to be compliant? And so it's a good opportunity to look for some efficiencies in your processes. Maybe isn't the time to make those changes, but it's sure a good time to look at that, process from that perspective and say, is everything in here really necessary? In this sort of shutdown mode, where some core critical processes are still running, but everything else is on hold. Maybe it's a good time to build in a little bit of flexibility to your processes to account and allow for those things to happen. Training is another good place to spend a little bit of time if you find some time on your hands. Are the records up to date? Looking at effectiveness as a whole, right? The regulators continue to scrutinize training effectiveness, and what does that mean? So is it a time to look at some of those riskier processes, or if they're still running right now, obviously they're more essential. What sort of additional controls might need to be in place, or are there controls in place that aren't necessary? It's a good time to look at some of the redundancy and see if you can kind of trim things back from that perspective. Quality planning, that sort of thing. This is a good time to look at those. Most of us, are just coming off of Q1 into Q2, depending on how your fiscal years are set up. We also do our quality planning in sort of that same cycle. So, it's a good time to spend a little effort and focus on some of those objectives, metrics, development plans, etc. Ezra, anything else you might add in here?
Well, we all know training is exciting, so and we've all been part of those organizations where everybody's read the docs that have been released and looked through them, but by the end of the year nobody could tell you what they've read. So use this time, if your organization has a lot of downtime, to just say, hey, let's talk about design control. Let's go over the main points. Let's go over the main points of risk management. Just some of the heavy hitters. It might be one of your best times to get everyone's focus, just depending on the situation you're in. So I know from personal experience, training and really documenting the effectiveness of your, training plan is just, it's one of those things that's really hard to stay on top of and really accurately gauge. So might be a good opportunity. I know I've reached out to a family member who right now is, he's in the medical industry and everything's shut down, and he's just like, I'm on conference calls all day and they're really just about nothing. Just trying to fill time, keep everybody communicating. So if you're in that situation, set up some light training material here and there, and kind of keep focused on, this is what we do, and it might be just a good milestone to get that knocked out, and really everyone caught up to what they've been doing the last year or so.
Yeah, good opportunity to short cycle that annual GMP training.
Yes.
So we all have to go through.
All right. Well, Kelly and Ezra, thank you very much. We're happy to take any questions if there are any. One thing I noticed, we have a few kind of consulting companies on the line. So, Kelly, in your past life, you were a consultant. You helped, multiple companies with, kind of managing their QMS. How any tips or thoughts there, like in that realm? Like, did you travel much when you were consulting and at Ezra as well, or did you do a lot of remote? Any thoughts or tips there for people in that way?
Yeah, sure. No, the consultants, welcome and thank you for joining us. Yeah, this is definitely an interesting situation to be in, for us personally, right? Most of the time with consulting, we're pretty used to working remotely, and I think that's just sort of been an evolution of the industry in general. Back in the day, we were always had to be on site all the time, right? And so there's definitely been some shift there as more and more organizations go to cloud-based software solutions, for example. It makes it a little bit easier to manage some of those kinds of questions and such. But yeah, I would imagine at this point, there's probably not a huge impact to you directly from the shift in how you're working. But again, helping our clients think about the impacts, and again making sure that I think that if I boiled all this down, making your quality system continue to work for you and continuing to document and whatever that means, and advising them to continue to document, and again, thinking about, shift in some of those communication policies, the training methodologies, those kinds of things could all be a big shift, for us to help manage.
I think it's also an opportunity too to discuss with your organization. I know everywhere I've been, I get a lot of questions outside of quality as a consultant or a QA employee that someone outside the department will ask, what's the answer to the regulations on this, or what's the standard say, how do you do this? And for a lot of them, if you're in QA, you'll know that, well, there's not really a set in stone answer. It's an interpretation that points you back to risk and safety and effectiveness. And if you stack on top of that what we're going through now with emergency use authorizations and just the shift in priorities, there's going to be more of that. I don't have an exact answer to that. So I guess I would say it's a good time to have that open discussion with your organization that, we don't have all the set in stone answers. And this is an example of that right now, of really just always pointing back to safety, effectiveness, continuous improvement in the organization, and documenting everything.
All right. So yeah, thanks, Ezra and Kelly. There's a question come in. There's a QA person with a small company, and they're still doing manual for quality receiving inspection, and they're preparing for an internal audit. They said this is their first audit a little nervous about it. So any thoughts on kind of your first internal audit? If by manual, I think they're saying still paper, but any thoughts on that, on the kind of the first audit and what they should prepare for?
Well, first audits are always nerve-wracking, and you're gonna have you just got to expect you're gonna have findings of some sort, and I think generally the auditor understands that as well. If this is your first audit, let's go through it. Let's find what we find, get things cleaned up. I think the expectations are a little different on first audit, so keep that in mind. Don't beat yourself up. I think as long as you're really showing throughout your system the intent to have things as correct and compliant or conforming to the standards as possible, that goes a long ways. So just keep that in mind. Don't over focus on, don't go down a rabbit hole in certain areas that, where you could just look at your whole system and make sure your intent is there to conform as much as possible. Kelly, you might have a lot more experience here too.
Yeah, and internal audits are certainly always, in my experience, the tone is very different than a regulator. The purpose of an internal audit is continuous improvement. At the end of the day, that is the expectation. So if you're, the person who's being audited, follow your procedures. Keep pointing back to your procedures. Stay within your procedures. If they find things that are a problem that are not within the boundaries of your procedure, then in the audit moment, they'll get noted as findings. The corrections to that will be updating the procedures to be more reflective of the correct process. If there are gaps in those sorts of things, the goal is to continuously improve your processes. Some companies take a very formal, like, okay, I'm going to pretend like the FDA as I walk through to it. Others take a more collaborative approach, because again, the goal at the end of the day is continuous improvement to your quality system. So I don't know that I wouldn't stress too much about the job from that perspective. Again, it is absolutely can be very nerve-wracking to be the auditee. Have been there, done that a few times, and do certainly remember feeling uncomfortable in those situations. At the end of the day, continuous improvement, follow your procedure. Those are the two most important things.
It's better to find it in internal audit than an official audit. So
yes,
don't try
absolutely.
to cut corners. Just you want to know everything that's going on, and if you're a small company and you're trying to figure out how to internal audit yourselves with trying to keep bias out of it and panicking over that, I would recommend hiring a third party that does it all the time, and just go into it knowing I want to have everything found. We want to get this fixed now. So
definitely.
I think Kelly's done a bit of that internally recently. Not a lot yet, but it's been something good for me to know. Just being in more of a learning and trying to grow and be a better organization. If we take that into mind, I think that's really important. So and that's how you should take internal audits for the most part. So yeah. Great. I think we're all up on questions. Kelly and Ezra, I really appreciate your preparing this, and I think for me this was great, kind of in the review section, and kind of maybe that one piece of advice of maybe one CAPA or one NCR to kind of contain everything might be a really good step right now. So that was one piece that was interesting advice to kind of take and think about. So I appreciate your time, and we're recording this. We'll make sure we give it out to everyone that registered and have it ready hopefully pretty soon. So thank you all, and I appreciate your time today.